The moment Peter Ashford crested the ridge above Silverton Valley and looked down at the thin curl of smoke rising from a chimney he had been told belonged to a dead woman, his hand went instinctively to the pistol at his hip. And then he heard it, drifting up through the cold morning air like something out of a dream he had not known he was having, the sound of someone humming. It was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was the kind of place where a man could ride 3 days without seeing another soul, where the sky pressed down hard on the land and the land pushed right back, and where the dead had a stubborn habit of not staying where they were put. Peter had ridden from Laramie with a photograph in his breast pocket, a folded letter from a lawyer who no longer practiced law, and a name that a dozen people in a dozen different towns had told him belonged to a woman 2 years in the ground. Ruby Morgan, killed in a fire at the Carson Creek homestead, they said, burned along with everything she owned, along with any record of where the money had gone, along with any trace of the inheritance that should have passed to her aunt in Cheyenne. Peter was not a lawman, though he had ridden with a marshal for 6 years before the marshal caught a bullet outside of Casper. He was not a bounty hunter, though he had brought back 3 men with prices on their heads in the years following. He was something in between a man who found things, who located people, who had a talent for following the thin thread of truth through the elaborate tapestry of other people's lies. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair gone a little long at the collar, and a jaw that had not met a razor in 4 days. He had gray eyes that people consistently described as unreadable, and a mouth that was, according to the woman who had run the boarding house in Laramie, built for something better than frowning. He sat his horse on that ridge for a long moment, looking down at the log cabin below him, at the small barn beside it, at the garden plot that had been turned for spring, at the 2 horses in the paddock, and at the small figure moving past the window with what he was increasingly certain was a cast iron skillet in her hand. The smoke from the chimney smelled of wood and, unless he was losing his mind, bacon. He touched his heels to his horse, a big, patient sorrel named August, and started down the slope. The trail into the valley was steep and switchbacked, cutting through stands of ponderosa pine that were just beginning to shake off the last of the winter's weight. It took him 20 minutes to reach the valley floor, and by the time he did the humming had stopped and a woman had appeared in the doorway of the cabin, shading her eyes with one hand and watching him approach. Even at 50 yards, he could see that she was not a ghost. She was entirely, stubbornly, inconveniently alive. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up but was doing a poor job of staying there, several strands falling loose around a face that was, and Peter made himself think this clinically, professionally, the way a man cataloging facts should think, quite remarkably beautiful. She wore a plain cotton dress in faded blue with a white apron over it, and she held a wooden spoon in one hand with the air of a woman who was prepared to use it as a weapon if the situation called for it. He reined August to a stop at a distance he judged to be polite, far enough not to crowd her, close enough to talk without shouting. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. Her voice was clear and direct. She did not move from the doorway. "I am looking for Silverton Valley," he said, which was a lie he had prepared, because a man riding up to a dead woman's door and announcing that he was there because she was supposed to be dead seemed like a poor opening. "You found it," she said. "Rode right through the middle of it. I can see that now." He took off his hat, which was something his mother had told him a man should do when addressing a woman, and it still felt like the right instinct even 20 years later. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water. It has been a long ride from the pass." She studied him for a moment. The spoon did not lower. "Your horse looks thirsty," she said finally. "You can use the trough beside the barn. I will bring out a cup for you." It was not an invitation inside. It was, he thought, the response of a woman who had learned to be careful. He watered August at the trough, unsaddled him without being asked because the horse had earned it, and was leaning against the fence post with his hat in his hands when she came out of the cabin carrying a tin cup and a plate with 2 biscuits on it. She handed him the cup first. The water was cold and tasted of limestone, which meant a good clean spring somewhere nearby. "You did not have to bring food," he said. "I made too many biscuits," she said simply. Then she stood there, watching him eat, because she was clearly not the kind of woman who made idle small talk or pretended that the presence of a strange man in her valley on a Tuesday morning was an ordinary thing. He ate the biscuits. They were very good. "Thank you," he said. "I am Peter Ashford." "Ruby Morgan," she said, and watched his face. He had practiced keeping his face still for 6 years under a marshal who had told him that a readable face was a liability. He was proud of what he had achieved in that time, but something must have flickered because Ruby Morgan's eyes narrowed and the wooden spoon came up about an inch. "You know that name," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her steadily. "I do," he said. "I was hired by a Mrs. Alois Crandall of Cheyenne to locate her niece." Mrs. Crandall believed her niece had died in a fire at the Carson Creek homestead approximately 2 years ago. Ruby Morgan did not move. She did not pale. She did not run. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a thing she has been expecting and dreading in roughly equal measure for a very long time. "Aunt Alois," she said quietly. "Is she well?" "She was well 3 weeks ago when I spoke with her," he said. "She misses you considerably." Something moved across Ruby Morgan's face that he could not name: grief, maybe, or relief, or the complicated feeling that lived between those two things. She looked away from him, out across the valley, at the mountains that rose on 3 sides like walls. "You had better come inside," she said. The inside of the cabin was small and clean and full of things that spoke of a life being carefully constructed. Shelves of preserves and dried herbs, a rag rug on the plank floor, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire with a book face down on the arm. The book was Oliver Twist, which he noticed because it was the same book his younger sister had been reading the last time he had seen her, 4 years ago. There was a rifle above the door, a pistol on the shelf beside the fireplace, and a knife on the kitchen work table that was rather more serious than anything that needed to be used on biscuits. A woman alone in the wilderness was not a woman who forgot to be afraid. She had simply decided to be armed instead. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, and set the cups on the table and sat down across from him like a woman preparing for a negotiation. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Slowly," he said, "and with some difficulty. You chose a good place to disappear." "I chose the most remote valley in the territory," she said. "Spent 6 months choosing it. The fire at Carson Creek," he said carefully. "The lawyer, Mr. Holt, told Mrs. Crandall that you were identified among the dead." Ruby wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her hands were capable hands, roughened by outdoor work, with a small scar along the right thumb that he thought might be from a knife. "Calvin Holt," she said, and the name came out with a particular flatness that told him more than any explanation could. "Calvin Holt is the reason I am here." He waited. He had learned that waiting was frequently more useful than asking. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Then she set down her coffee and told him. Her father, James Morgan, had owned 400 acres of good grazing land in the Carson Creek Valley, along with a herd of cattle that had been worth considerable money at the time of his death 3 years ago. Ruby had been his only child. Her mother had died when she was 12. The will had been straightforward, everything to Ruby, held in trust by the law firm of Holt and Barrett until her 25th birthday or her marriage, whichever came first. Calvin Holt had been managing the estate. He had also, as it emerged when Ruby turned 25 and began asking questions, been managing it into his own pocket for 2 years. When she started demanding an accounting, he had started making offers of a different kind, first to buy the land at a price that was roughly a third of its value, and then, when she refused, to marry her, which would have given him legal control of everything. Ruby had refused that too. 3 months after her 25th birthday, the Carson Creek homestead had burned to the ground while she was in town. Calvin Holt had told everyone she had gone back for something and had not escaped. He had produced a death certificate signed by a doctor whose name Ruby had never heard. He had assumed control of the Morgan estate on the grounds that the estate's sole heir had died intestate. He was so certain I would simply accept it, Ruby said. Her voice was even, but her jaw was tight. Or that I would be frightened enough to disappear. He was correct about the second part. You have been here for 2 years, Peter said. 22 months, she said. I bought this land through an intermediary before the fire. I knew something was coming. I did not know it would be quite so final. She looked at the window, at the mountains outside. I had nowhere to go where he could not find me, and no one who would believe me against a lawyer, so I came here. Your aunt believes you, Peter said. Ruby looked back at him, and he saw something shift in her expression, something younger and more vulnerable than the composed, careful woman who had been sitting across from him. Aunt Alois always believed me, she said softly. She was my father's sister. She knew Calvin Holt for what he was from the beginning. Mrs. Crandall has retained legal representation in Cheyenne, Peter said. A different firm. She has been gathering evidence for 8 months. She sent me to find you because the case against Holt is nearly complete, and the new lawyer, a Mr. Garrison, believes your testimony, and your being alive, is the last piece needed. Ruby was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, August moved in the paddock with a soft, rhythmic sound. He will know, she said. When I come back, he will know I am alive and he will do something. That is a reasonable concern, Peter said. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. It is also why Mrs. Crandall sent me specifically. I know how to move people from one place to another without being seen. Ruby looked at him with a directness that he found unexpectedly refreshing. Most people looked away from him or looked at him sideways or looked at the floor. Ruby Morgan looked him straight in the eye. Who are you really, Mr. Ashford? She asked. Not your name. I believe your name. I mean, what kind of man does this? He considered the question honestly. I was a deputy marshal for 6 years, he said. Under Marshal Cole Deering out of Laramie. He was killed in '76. After that I found other work. You find people, she said, among other things, and you brought them back even when they did not want to go. He looked at her steadily. I brought back fugitives from justice, he said. You are not a fugitive from justice. You are a woman who was wronged and ran, which is a different thing entirely. He paused. I do not take anyone anywhere against their will, Miss Morgan. If you tell me to ride back the way I came and say nothing, I will do that. She studied him for another long moment. Outside, a morning bird began to call something bright and persistent in the pines. You would do that, she said. Just ride away. You came all this way. I came to find you, he said. I found you. What happens next is your decision. Something in Ruby Morgan's face changed at that. It was subtle, and he might have missed it if he had not been paying very close attention, which he was, because he could not seem to stop. It was like watching a door open a quarter of an inch, just enough to suggest that what was behind it might be extraordinary. Stay for breakfast, she said. I have bacon on the stove, and I did say I made too many biscuits. He stayed for breakfast. It was the best meal he had eaten in 4 months. She cooked the way she did everything else, he observed, efficiently, without waste, with a quiet competence that looked nothing like effort. The bacon was from a pig she had kept herself, she explained, and butchered in October. The eggs were from 6 hens she kept in a small coop behind the barn. She had a kitchen garden that she had expanded each spring, adding new varieties of herbs and vegetables, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin that she showed him after breakfast with the careful pride of someone who had built something they were genuinely pleased with. You built all of this yourself? He asked, standing at the entrance to the root cellar, looking at the neat rows of preserved jars, the bins of winter vegetables still holding on, the hanging dried herbs. Most of it, she said. I hired 2 men from the town of Ridgeback, that is 4 hours' ride east, to help with the barn framing. They did not know my name. I paid them in cash and they did not ask questions. She looked at the root cellar with an expression he could only describe as fierce affection. Everything else I did myself. He thought about that as they walked back toward the cabin. He thought about what it cost a person, what particular quality of determination and loneliness it required to build a life from scratch in a remote mountain valley, alone, with no one knowing you were alive. "You are not going to say I should not have had to do it," she said, glancing at him sideways. "You should not have had to do it," he said. "But since you did, you should know that you did it remarkably well." She looked at him again with that direct, measuring look. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Ashford. I have been told that before," he said, generally not as a compliment. The corner of her mouth lifted. It was the first time he had seen it do that, and he found that he would like very much to see it again. He did not ride away that day. He told himself it was practical. He needed to discuss the plan with her, to explain what Mrs. Crandall's lawyer needed, to work out the logistics of getting her from this valley to Cheyenne without Calvin Holt or any of his associates knowing she was coming. These were legitimate reasons. They required time and conversation. They were not, he assured himself as he made his bedroll in the barn that night, at all connected to the way Ruby Morgan moved through her days with a quiet, unhurried sureness that made him feel unexpectedly like he was watching something rare. She came to the barn door that evening with a lantern and a rolled blanket. "The nights are still cold," she said, handing him the blanket. "There is frost most mornings." "I noticed," he said. "Thank you." She stood in the doorway with the lantern, and the light threw gold across her face and made her hair look like autumn itself, and he looked at the wall of the barn very deliberately. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said. "About going back. And I am afraid," she said, with a plainness that seemed characteristic of her. "I want you to know that so you understand I am not going into this without knowing what I am doing. I am frightened of Calvin Holt and what he might do, but I am more frightened of living the rest of my life in this valley pretending to be dead and never seeing my aunt again and never—" She stopped. She looked at the lantern. "I built this place because I needed somewhere safe. But I have been here long enough to know that a cage is a cage no matter how well you build it." He looked at her then, and he did not look away. "We will go back through Ridgeback and pick up the main trail," he said. "I will ride point. We move careful and we move smart. Holt is in Cheyenne, not on the trail." "How long?" 8 days to Cheyenne, maybe 10 if the passes are bad." She nodded slowly. "I will need a day to close the cabin," she said, "to make sure everything is—" She paused. "I do not know if I am coming back." "That will depend on the outcome," he agreed. "Yes," she said. She looked around the barn, at August in his stall, at the neat stacks of her own supplies, at the life she had built here. "Yes, I suppose it will." She left him to his bedroll and the warmth of the barn, and he lay there in the dark listening to the horses and to the vast quiet of the valley and thinking that he had ridden into this place looking for a ghost and had instead found the most alive person he had encountered in years. She spent the following day with a methodical thoroughness that impressed him, banking the fire, sealing the preserves she was leaving behind, making arrangements for the hens and the pigs. She wrote a note in a sealed envelope and asked Peter to ride it to a neighboring homestead, 4 miles down the valley, where a family named Greer would, she explained, look after the animals if she did not return. He rode to the Greer place and back, and when he returned she was standing in the paddock with her 2 horses, a sturdy gray she called Patience and a smaller black she called Ink, and she was talking to them quietly, the way people talk to horses when they know that the horses understand the feeling if not the words. He unsaddled August and gave the horses their grain, and he and Ruby ate supper at the kitchen table, venison stew she had put on that morning, with the last of the winter potatoes and more of those excellent biscuits, and talked about the route. He laid out his map on the table and she leaned over it beside him, close enough that he could smell the wood smoke and soap smell of her hair, and she pointed out 2 passages through the mountains that were not on the map. "I have ridden every trail in this valley," she said, "and several beyond it. A woman alone cannot afford to know only one way in and one way out." He looked at the passages she indicated. They were not shortcuts exactly, but they were less exposed than the routes he had planned, and she knew the terrain better than any map. "We use yours," he said. She looked at him with a small, pleased expression that she seemed to be trying to suppress. "All right," she said. They left at first light, with the frost still white on the grass and the sky going from black to deep violet to a thin, sharp blue. Ruby rode Patience and led Ink, and Peter rode August, and they went single file up through the pines and into the first of her mountain passages, which turned out to be a narrow draw between two rock faces that opened unexpectedly onto a broad upland meadow, entirely sheltered from the wind, with a spring-fed stream running through it. "I found this in my second month here," Ruby said, stopping to let the horses drink. "I used to come here when I needed to remember that the world was larger than my valley." He watched her sit her horse in the middle of that meadow, her face tipped up to the morning sun, her eyes closed for just a moment. The frost was melting off the grass and the air was sharp and clean, and somewhere in the pines a meadowlark was winding itself up for the morning's full performance. "It is a good place," he said. "Most of Wyoming is a good place," she said, opening her eyes, "if you can stay alive in it." They rode for 6 hours that first day, stopping at midday in the shelter of a rock outcrop to eat the provisions Ruby had packed: dried venison, hard cheese, dried apple slices, water from the canteen. She ate efficiently and without ceremony. She was, he noticed, an excellent rider. She had a light, sure seat, and she read her horse's mood with an attention that spoke of long hours in the saddle. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. It was a conversational question, the kind of question two people ask when they are beginning to learn each other. He had been conscious all morning of learning her, the way you learn a landscape feature by feature, the way one valley gives onto another. "Carson Creek," she said. "Born there. My father built the house when he was 23. I used to think I would live and die in that valley." She was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about that. I am from Pennsylvania," he said. "A town called Morganville, no relation, I assume." She laughed at that. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a good laugh, genuine and unguarded, the laugh of someone who usually kept things close but occasionally forgot to. "No relation," she confirmed. "My family was Virginia Morgan before they came west. My grandfather left Virginia because he was the third son and there was nothing for him there." "My father was a schoolteacher," Peter said. "Which is why I can read and why I left as soon as I was old enough to do so. I was not built for schoolrooms." "What were you built for?" He considered that seriously because she asked it seriously. "Movement," he said. "Finding things, being in the middle of something that matters." She nodded as if that made sense to her. "I think I understand that," she said. "I spent 2 years building a life in that valley, but I always knew it was a waiting life, not a real one." "What is a real life for you?" She looked at him, and he thought for a moment she might deflect, might give him a light answer or a practical one. Instead she said slowly, as if she were deciding the words as she went, "Being somewhere that is mine by right and not by hiding. Having people who know my name and mean it when they say it. Doing work that matters." She paused. "And I think not being alone. I was willing to be alone because it was necessary. I am not sure it is what I want." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said, "I do not think it is." They made camp that night in a stand of cottonwoods beside a creek. He built the fire and she cooked. She had brought a small pot and the makings of a simple bean soup, and they sat across from each other in the firelight. And the conversation moved the way good conversation does, without agenda and without end, one thing opening naturally onto the next. She asked him about his time as a deputy marshal, and he told her about Cole Deering, who had been the best man he had ever worked for, patient, fair, with a bone-deep understanding of what the law was supposed to be for. He told her about the day Deering was shot, outside a saloon in Casper, by a man who was angry about a horse. He told her how he had ridden the man down and brought him back, and how after that he had found he could not go back to the marshal's office, which had a new marshal who smelled of politics and fear. She listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking it in, following the thread. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The certainty of it, maybe, knowing who you were and what you were supposed to do." He thought about that. "I miss Deering," he said. "The rest of it, I am not sure I miss anything that was taken away from me so much as I have been looking for something to replace it." She looked at the fire. "That I understand very well," she said softly. On the third day of riding, they came down from the mountains and onto the lower plains, and the landscape changed from vertical to horizontal, from peaks and draws to the long, rolling grassland that made Wyoming feel like the sea. The sky opened up, and the wind came from the southwest, warm and carrying the smell of spring. Ruby rode up beside him on the wider trail, and they rode abreast for the first time. And without quite planning it, they talked all afternoon about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or inheritance or Calvin Holt, about books they had read, about the best meal each of them had ever eaten, about whether dogs or horses were more loyal, about what they would do if they could do anything in the world without consequence. "I would go to San Francisco," Ruby said. "I have read about it. The bay, the hills. I would like to see the ocean from there." "I was in San Francisco once," he said. 1872. I was chasing a man who had stolen money from a widow in Laramie. Did you catch him?" "In a gambling house on the waterfront," he said. "He had lost most of the widow's money by then." Oh no. She looked genuinely distressed on behalf of this widow she had never met. "He had won it back and then some," Peter said. "Pure dumb luck. I returned the original sum and most of the interest, and he went to prison for the rest." "What was the city like?" He described it as well as he could, the fog that rolled in from the bay, the hills so steep that a horse could barely manage them, the smell of salt and fish, and the strange, wonderful chaos of a city built on gold and hope, and the labor of 1,000 different peoples. He described Chinatown, the fishing boats, the great wooden piers. She listened with her eyes bright and her chin lifted. "I will go there someday," she said, with the kind of certainty that had clearly sustained her through 2 years alone in a mountain valley. "I believe you," he said, and he meant it completely. On the fourth night, camped beside a rock formation that the locals called Bishop's Crown, Ruby asked him something she had been circling for days. "What do you believe will happen," she said, "when we reach Cheyenne?" With Holt, he was honest with her. Garrison, the lawyer, believes the evidence is strong. Land records, bank records, the testimony of several witnesses who have come forward since Mrs. Crandall began pressing the case. Your testimony and your being alive closes the central fraud. Holt cannot maintain that you died and the estate passed to him if you are sitting in a courtroom. And outside the courtroom, she pressed. "Holt is a powerful man in Cheyenne," Peter said. "He has money and connections. But he is also a man who has been living on stolen ground, and those men are always more afraid than they appear, because they know what they took and they know what would happen if it came out. He will threaten and bluster and likely try to settle. Garrison's advice, as I understand it, will be to refuse any settlement." "Good," Ruby said. "I want my land back. What he took in money I care about less, but the land was your father's." "Was my father's," she said, "and my grandfather's before that. People worked and bled for that land. I am not settling." He looked at her in the firelight and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, a genuine, uncomplicated admiration. "No," he said, "I would not expect you to." She looked at him steadily across the fire, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable but warm, the kind of silence that two people share when they have said enough for the moment and everything else can wait. "I am glad it was you who found me," she said quietly. "I was afraid of what finding might look like. I thought it would be men with guns and horses and a great deal of noise." "It was one man," he said, "and a horse, and a great deal of biscuits." She laughed again. He had decided by now that her laugh was one of the finest things he had ever heard. On the fifth day, the weather turned. The warm southwest wind shifted in the night, and by morning the sky had gone the color of old pewter, pressing low over the plains, and by mid-morning the rain was coming in sideways, cold and persistent, soaking through coats and turning the trail to mud. The horses were unhappy, and the world contracted to a gray circle 50 yards in every direction. Ruby rode with her hat pulled down and her coat collar up, and she did not complain, which Peter noted and appreciated. When the lightning started in the distance, he scanned the landscape for shelter and found it in the form of an old way station at the junction of two trails abandoned. By the look of it, the sign long since fallen and illegible, but the structure still sound. They got the horses into the small attached barn, barely large enough for 3 horses but dry and out of the wind, and then ducked inside the main building, which was a single room with a fireplace, some broken furniture, and a smell of old wood and disuse. Peter found enough dry wood stacked against the inside wall to get a fire going, and they hung their wet coats and sat as close to the fire as was reasonable while the rain hammered the roof and the thunder rolled across the plain outside. "Have you ever been caught out like this before?" she asked. "Many times," he said. "Wyoming storms are particularly enthusiastic." "I lost a section of my barn roof in a storm last October," Ruby said. "I spent 3 days in November replacing it." Alone in the cold on a ladder, she looked at her hands. "I am a better carpenter than I would have preferred to be. That is the kind of skill that tends to develop under necessity," he said. She turned toward him slightly, her shoulder dropping, her posture losing some of its careful uprightness. She was, he thought, beginning to be easier, beginning to let him see a little more. "My father would have laughed," she said, quietly and without sadness, just a simple statement of affection. "He always said that I could learn to do anything if someone tried to stop me. He meant it as a compliment. It sounds like one. He was a good man." She looked at the fire. "He trusted the wrong lawyer." "But that is not the worst thing a man can do." "No," Peter agreed. "That is not the worst thing." The rain went on for 3 hours and then stopped abruptly, the way Wyoming rain does, leaving the air washed clean and the sky going gold toward sunset. They ate from their packs. Ruby had organized their provisions with a precision that meant they were never short and never wasteful, and slept on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in their blankets, on the somewhat creaking floor of the old way station. He lay awake for a long time listening to her breathe and to the dripping of water off the eaves and to the far-off sound of a coyote working through the night. He realized with a clarity that surprised him, not thinking about the job. He was not thinking about Calvin Holt or the trial or the route to Cheyenne. He was thinking about the woman sleeping 10 feet away, and about how her laugh sounded, and about the way she had said she was glad it was him who had found her. He had found a lot of people. He had never before felt that the finding was personal. He rolled over and went to sleep before he could think about that any more thoroughly. The 6th day was all sunshine and birdsong and mud drying rapidly in the warm wind. They made good time, crossing a river at a ford Ruby had known about. She had marked it on the copy of the map she had made for herself. Clearly a woman who believed in being prepared for every contingency. And by midday they were on a well-traveled trail that would carry them directly to Ridgeback by nightfall. Ridgeback was a proper town, small but real, with a main street of 6 businesses, a hotel, a livery stable, and a saloon. Ruby pulled her hat low when they rode in, and he positioned himself between her and the street as they moved to the livery stable, which he thought was either instinct or practice on his part, and probably both. "I do not think anyone here would know me," Ruby said quietly as they handed off the horses to the stable boy. "I only came here twice, and I kept to myself." "Habits of caution are worth keeping," he said. He got them 2 rooms at the hotel, small, clean, with actual beds, which after 5 nights on the ground felt luxurious to an unreasonable degree. He arranged supper to be sent up rather than eating in the main dining room, and they sat at the small table in Ruby's room with real food: roast beef, potatoes, bread that was fresh that day. And he watched the pleasure move across her face at the simple fact of a hot meal she had not cooked herself. "When did you last eat in a town?" he asked. She thought about it. 14 months ago, she said. "I rode to Ridgeback for supplies. I ate standing up at a pie counter and was back on the trail within the hour." He thought about 14 months of eating alone in a mountain valley and looked at his roast beef. "You never told your aunt where you were," he said. "You let her believe you were dead." "I wrote to her once," Ruby said, and her voice tightened slightly. "6 months after the fire. I told her I was alive and I was safe, and I could not say more because I was afraid the letter would be intercepted. I did not know if she received it." "She did," Peter said. "She told me. It was why she never fully accepted the story of your death and why she began investigating Holt." He looked at her. "She has been trying to find you for a year, Miss Morgan. She hired 2 other men before me. They could not locate you." Ruby looked down at her plate. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "She sounds exactly like herself," she said. "Anna Loyce never gives up on anything." "No," he said. "She does not. She is a very determined woman. I can see where you might come by it." Ruby blinked quickly twice, and then she straightened her shoulders and took a brisk, practical bite of bread, which he recognized as a woman organizing herself back to steadiness. 2 days more?" she asked. "Roughly," he said. "We stay on the main trail from here. More people, less exposure." She nodded. 2 days, she said, as if fixing it in her mind. He went to his own room that night and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the fact that he had perhaps 50 hours left of having a reason to be anywhere near Ruby Morgan, after which he would have delivered her to her aunt and her lawyer and her reclaimed life, and his job would be done, and there would be no particular logic to his continued presence. He did not like this thought. He put it away for later, got into the actual bed, and slept better than he had in months. The 7th day brought them back into company on the trail: wagons, other riders, a cattle drive moving south that required them to wait at a crossroads for 40 minutes while several hundred unhappy longhorns were persuaded past by 3 cowboys and a dog. Ruby watched the cattle with knowledgeable attention. "Those are good cattle," she said. "Carson Creek cattle were better, but those are good." "You know cattle?" he asked. "I grew up with cattle," she said. "My father had 400 head at his peak. I can rope and brand and read a herd. My father did not see any reason why I should not know his business." He looked at her. "He was a remarkable man," he said. "He was," she said simply. "I have been very angry on his behalf these 2 years. Holt cheated a good man's memory. I am going to make that right." She said it without drama, just as a statement of fact, and the matter-of-fact certainty of it was more powerful than any passionate declaration would have been. On the 7th night they camped at a public campsite on the South Fork of the Laramie River, surrounded by other travelers, a family in a covered wagon heading north, 2 miners heading south, and an older gentleman in a well-worn suit who turned out to be a traveling doctor making his rounds of the smaller settlements. The traveling doctor, whose name was Dr. Beaumont, invited them to share his fire, which was larger and better situated than their own, and over the course of 2 hours managed to conduct what Peter observed was essentially a social examination of both of them, asking questions of apparently casual interest that were, he realized, actually quite pointed. After Dr. Beaumont had excused himself to his bedroll, Ruby turned to Peter with a look of amused exasperation. "He was trying to determine whether we are married," she said. "I noticed," Peter said. "He concluded that we were not, but that the situation was, I believe his word was, developing." Peter looked at the fire. "Observant man," he said carefully. Ruby looked at him steadily, with the directness that was as much a part of her as her hair or her voice. "Peter," she said, using his given name for the first time, and he felt it the way you feel a change in the air before a storm, something atmospheric, something that rearranges the whole quality of the moment. "Yes," he said. "When we reach Cheyenne," she said, "and the matter with Holt is resolved, what will you do?" He met her eyes. "I have not decided," he said, which was honest because he had not, but which was also not entirely the truth, because the thing he was considering doing felt large enough that he was being careful with it. "Where is the work for you?" she asked. "After this?" "There is always work," he said. "Someone who needs finding, something that needs locating." He paused. "I have been doing it long enough that I sometimes wonder what I would do if I stopped." "What would you want to do if you stopped?" He looked at her for a long, candid moment. "Stay somewhere," he said. "For a while, long enough to see what it is like." Ruby looked at him, and he looked at her, and the fire crackled between them, and the night was very wide and very dark and very full of stars. "I think I would like that too," she said quietly. And then she got up and went to her bedroll with a serenity that he could only admire, and he stayed by the fire for a long time after that, looking at the stars, which were as magnificent as they always were in the Wyoming night, and thinking thoughts he had not let himself think in a very long time. The 8th day was the day they rode into Cheyenne. The city was bigger than Ruby had seen it last. The railroad had been here for a decade now, and it showed, in the brick buildings going up on Capitol Avenue, in the traffic of the streets, in the particular busy noise of a place that was transforming itself from a frontier town into something more permanent. Ruby rode in with her hat brim pulled down and her back straight and her hands easy on the reins, looking exactly like someone who had ridden into towns with a purpose for most of her life. They went directly to the office of Garrison and Webb, attorneys at law, on Ferguson Street, which turned out to be on the second floor of a building that also housed a dry goods merchant and a surveyor. Mr. Garrison himself came to the door when his clerk announced them, a lean, energetic man of about 50 with ink stains on his fingers and very sharp blue eyes. He looked at Ruby for a long moment. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I am very glad to see you alive." "So am I," she said, "Mrs." Eloise Crandall was at the boarding house on Cary Avenue where she had taken rooms while waiting for the investigation to conclude. She was 62 years old, small and upright, with white hair and the particular posture of a woman who had decided several decades ago that the world's nonsense was beneath her dignity. She came through the door of her sitting room and stopped when she saw Ruby, and then she crossed the room in 3 steps and took her niece in her arms without any of the cautious preliminaries that other people might have employed. Peter stood in the doorway and watched them and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could accurately account for. He gave them the afternoon. He took August to the best livery stable in Cheyenne and paid for a proper stall with good hay and extra oats, which August received with the dignified appreciation of a horse who felt he had earned it. He got a room at a respectable hotel and had a bath, which was possibly the best thing that had happened to him in 6 weeks. He shaved his jaw for the first time in 10 days. He ate a proper meal at a proper restaurant and thought about what came next. What came next was the meeting with Garrison the following morning, at which Ruby gave her full testimony for the record, with Peter present at her request. She was calm and precise and utterly devastating in her recollection of every interaction with Calvin Holt, every financial irregularity she had discovered, every threat both implied and explicit, the fire at Carson Creek, and her subsequent 22 months in Silverton Valley. Garrison had additional documentation, ready bank records subpoenaed by court order, letters between Holt and the corrupt doctor who had signed the false death certificate, testimony from 2 of Morgan's former ranch hands who had been pressured into signing documents they had not been shown clearly. The case, Peter realized, was not merely strong. It was complete. "Holt will be served today," Garrison said at the end of the meeting. "The sheriff is a reliable man and the warrant is in order. I do not anticipate violence. Holt is a coward in the traditional sense, brave when the odds are in his favor and spineless when they are not. He will attempt to negotiate." "He may attempt to run," Peter said. "He may," Garrison said, "which is why the sheriff will also be at his offices before he can be warned." He looked at Ruby. "The land, Miss Morgan, will be returned. The fraudulent estate transfer will be voided. The money he extracted, some of it we can recover, some has been spent. We will pursue the full amount." "The land is enough," Ruby said, which was almost exactly what she had said to Peter on the trail, and hearing her say it again, in this office, to this lawyer, with the full weight of the law finally on her side, felt to him like watching something long bent straighten itself out. Calvin Holt was arrested on the afternoon of that same day. Peter was not there for it, but Garrison sent a clerk to the hotel with a note before supper. Holt in custody. Trial date to be set. All goes as expected. He took the note to Ruby at her aunt's boarding house. She read it, folded it carefully, and set it on the table beside the tea service that Mrs. Crandall had provided, and she sat very still for a moment. "It is real," she said. "It is real," he said. "I keep expecting something to go wrong," she said. "Something may still go wrong," he said honestly. "Legal proceedings are complicated, but the foundation is solid, and you have Garrison, who appears to be genuinely good at his work." She looked at him. "And I have you," she said quietly, and then caught herself slightly, not in embarrassment but with a kind of careful attention, "the way you handle something valuable. This would have been much harder without you, not just the writing, the knowing that someone," she paused, "that someone believed me, before there was any proof, just on my word." He had believed her, he realized, from the first biscuit. From the moment she had stood in her doorway with a wooden spoon and watched him ride into her valley with a composed, watchful dignity. He had believed her before she told him a word of her story, which was either excellent instinct or something else that he was increasingly not inclined to call instinct. "Your word was enough," he said. Mrs. Crandall chose that particular moment to come back into the sitting room with a fresh pot of tea, which Peter suspected was not accidental, because Mrs. Crandall struck him as the kind of woman who missed nothing and timed everything. She poured tea for all three of them and settled into her chair with the satisfaction of a woman conducting a successful operation, and she told Ruby about everything that had happened in the 2 years of her absence: family news, town news, the progress of the case. And she told Peter, apparently incidentally but with obvious intent, about the Morgan estate. 400 acres of good grazing land, a house that could be rebuilt, a herd that had been reduced but not eliminated. She mentioned, also apparently incidentally, that it was a great deal for a single woman to manage alone. Peter drank his tea. Ruby glanced at him once sideways quickly, with an expression he was becoming expert in reading, the expression of a woman who was very much aware of what her aunt was doing and was choosing not to discourage it. He set down his teacup. "Mrs. Crandall," he said, "I wonder if I might call on your niece tomorrow. I would like to show her, that is, I thought she might enjoy seeing the city, before the work of the trial begins in earnest." Mrs. Crandall smiled the smile of a woman who has been proved right about something she has been patient about for a long time. "What a pleasant idea," she said. Ruby did not say anything. But when he rose to leave and said good night, and she walked him to the door of the boarding house, and he stood in the evening air of Cheyenne with his hat in his hands, she looked at him with her direct, clear, undefended eyes and said, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, he said. He walked back to his hotel feeling considerably lighter than the situation warranted. He took her to breakfast first, a proper restaurant on Capitol Avenue that did an excellent job with eggs and had real coffee. And then, because she had mentioned the ocean and San Francisco and wanting to see things, he took her to the Capitol building, which was new and grand, and to the railroad station, which was the largest she had been in, and to a bookshop on Cary Avenue where she stopped for 45 minutes and emerged with 3 books and the expression of a person who has been given a gift they very much needed. They walked along the main street of Cheyenne, and she looked at everything with her particular attention, taking it all in, cataloging it, making sense of it. She was a woman who looked at the world as if it deserved to be fully understood. "It is strange to be among people again," she said. "I keep calculating how many people are around me. In the valley I could go weeks without seeing another face. Does it feel good or uncomfortable?" "Both," she said honestly. "Mostly good. I had forgotten how much noise people make." She smiled. "I had also forgotten how much I miss it." They were walking past a photography studio, one of the new kind with a proper camera which had come to the larger western towns in the past decade, and Peter stopped. "Would you like a photograph?" he asked. "For your aunt?" Ruby looked at the studio window, where sample photographs were displayed, portraits, mostly, families and individuals in their best clothes. "I have never had one taken," she said. "Then you are overdue," he said. They went in. The photographer, a young man named Caldwell who seemed genuinely pleased to have customers on a quiet Wednesday, sat Ruby in a chair by the window and spent several minutes arranging the light and her position to his satisfaction. Ruby sat with her spine straight and her hands folded and her chin at a slight angle, and she looked directly at the camera with the same unflinching attention she turned on everything. "You too, sir," Caldwell said, looking at Peter. "Together," Peter said and looked at Ruby. Ruby considered for exactly 2 seconds. "Together," she said. He sat beside her. Caldwell arranged 2 chairs, and he was aware very acutely of her shoulder an inch from his and the warmth of her and the specific quality of this moment, which was being recorded now as a fact, permanent and unambiguous. Caldwell said to hold still. Peter looked at the camera. He was also, though he made no comment about it, very aware that he was smiling. The photograph, when Caldwell produced it, he had a quick development process he was clearly proud of, showed 2 people sitting side by side with the particular composed stillness of the medium. But something about it, some warmth in the angle of their shoulders and the quality of the light on both their faces, spoke of more than professional association. Ruby looked at it for a long moment. "I like this," she said quietly, and he could not quite tell whether she meant the photograph or something larger. They ate lunch at a small place near the courthouse. Soup and bread, plain and good, and over lunch she told him things she had not told him on the trail. About her childhood at Carson Creek, about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher herself and had made sure Ruby could read and cipher and argue a point before she was 12. About the year after her father's death when she had tried to run the ranch herself while Holt was supposedly managing the estate, and how she had known something was wrong long before she had any proof. About the loneliness of Silverton Valley, which was a different kind of loneliness than she had expected, not just the absence of people but the absence of being known. "No one in that valley knew who I was," she said. "The Greers, the closest family, I was just a woman who had bought some land up in the hills. Quiet, kept to herself. They were kind to me, but they did not know my name, my real name." "I know your name," he said. She looked at him. "You do," she said, and then very carefully, as if she were approaching something that required care, "Peter." "Ruby," he said. They looked at each other across the soup bowls and the bread, and the restaurant went on around them with its ordinary noise, and nothing about the moment was dramatic or large, but something had been named, in the way that names matter, not just as labels but as recognitions. He walked her back to her aunt's boarding house in the late afternoon, and at the door he held her hand to say goodbye, because it was the appropriate thing to do in 1878 in a city, and the handshake lasted approximately twice as long as a handshake needed to, and neither of them made a comment about that. "Tomorrow I meet with Garrison again," she said, "to review the full testimony before the trial preparation begins." "I know," he said. "I will be available if you need anything." She looked at him. "I will need someone to tell me if I am being ridiculous," she said. "I have a tendency, when I am nervous, to be very formal and very controlled, and Garrison might mistake it for coldness." "You are not cold," he said. "Anyone who has sat across a fire from you for 8 nights knows that." A color came into her cheeks that was very becoming. She looked at their joined hands, still connected, and then at his face. "8 nights is a long time," she said. "It is," he said, "and not long at all depending on how you count." "How do you count it?" He held her gaze. "As the best 8 nights I have spent in a very long time," he said, which was understated to the point of being almost comical, but was also precisely true. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, and then released it and went inside, and he stood on the street of Cheyenne for a moment in the golden late afternoon light before he started walking back to his hotel, and he was smiling again, which he had apparently forgotten how to stop doing. The trial preparation took 3 weeks, during which Peter remained in Cheyenne because Garrison asked him to remain available as a potential witness regarding the circumstances of Ruby's discovery and the state of the Morgan property as found. He did not examine this reason too closely. During those 3 weeks he saw Ruby every day. It was not something they had formally arranged. It was something that happened organically, in the way that things happen when two people have discovered each other, and find that the discovering is ongoing and has not reached its natural terminus. He met her at Garrison's office, and they walked together after the meetings. He joined her and Mrs. Crandall for Sunday dinner, which Mrs. Crandall made very much her project, producing a meal of such excellence that Peter suspected she had been practicing. He brought Ruby books from the bookshop, titles he thought she might like, based on Oliver Twist and the 3 books she had chosen for herself, and she returned the favor by leaving a volume of poetry outside his hotel room door one morning without comment, a note on the cover that said in her even, clear handwriting, "For the man who believes in things before he has proof." He read the poetry. He had not read poetry since his mother's sitting room in Pennsylvania, and he found that it still moved something in him that nothing else quite reached. He wrote her a note back. It said, "I was given very good evidence early on." She arrived at his hotel with a look of amusement and something warmer than amusement. "You are talking about the biscuits again," she said. "Among other things," he said. They were standing in the hallway of his hotel, which was not an ideal location for a conversation of this nature, and he was acutely aware of that, but also of the fact that she had come here herself, on her own initiative, and that her eyes were very bright and her chin was tilted, and she looked entirely like a woman who had made up her mind about something and was waiting to see if the other person had made up theirs. "Ruby," he said. "Peter," she said. "I am going to stay in Cheyenne through the trial," he said. "And I would like, after the trial, to come with you to Carson Creek, to see the land, to help you think about what comes next, and after that," he stopped. He was not normally a man who found himself at a loss for words. He was finding himself there now. "After that, I would like to not leave. If you are, if there is—" "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I have not actually asked anything yet," he said. "I know," she said, "but you were going to, and the answer is yes." She looked at him with that clear, direct gaze. "I am not a woman who needs things dressed up, Peter. I know what I feel. I knew it on the trail. I have been waiting for you to catch up." He felt a laugh rise in him, genuine, surprised, entirely delighted. "I am generally faster than this," he said. "I know," she said, and she was smiling now, the full, unguarded smile he had seen only occasionally and treasured each time. But it was a complex trail. He took her hand. He held it properly, not as a handshake, but with his fingers wrapping around hers, and he looked at her for a long, unguarded moment, and he said, "I have never once in 31 years found a place that felt like somewhere I wanted to stay. I want to stay now. I would like to stay with you." Her hand tightened on his. "Then stay," she said simply. He kissed her there in the hallway of the hotel, which was not where such things were supposed to happen in 1878 in polite Cheyenne society. But Ruby Morgan had never been a woman who worried overly much about where things were supposed to happen, and he had rather ceased to care as well. Calvin Holt's trial was set for late May and lasted 6 days. The courtroom was packed on every day because Holt had been a prominent figure and the collapse of his position was of considerable public interest. Ruby sat at the plaintiff's table with Garrison and his associate, and she testified on the 3rd day for 4 hours. Peter sat in the gallery and watched her. She was magnificent. There was no other word for it. She was composed without being cold, precise without being mechanical, and when Holt's defense attorney attempted to suggest that her disappearance after the fire was evidence of some guilty intent on her own part, she turned to him with a patience that had a very sharp edge and said, "My intent was to survive." A man who burns your house and forges your death certificate and steals everything your father worked his life to build does not generally leave you with many alternatives. I chose the one that kept me alive. The courtroom was very quiet after that. Holt was convicted on all counts. The sentence was 5 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison and the full restitution of the Morgan estate, including the land, the remaining cattle, and as much of the extracted money as could be recovered. It was not perfect. Justice Holt would be out in 5 years. The money was partially gone, and 2 years of Ruby's life could not be given back. But it was real, and it was final, and it was legally binding. And when Garrison shook Ruby's hand outside the courthouse in the May sunshine, he said, "Miss Morgan, your father's estate is yours." And she stood for a moment in the light with her eyes closed and her face turned upward. And then she opened her eyes and found Peter in the small crowd and looked at him. And the look between them contained everything that needed to be said. Mrs. Crandall declared that this required dinner, and produced it that evening at the boarding house with the same determined excellence she brought to all her projects. She made a pot roast that Peter suspected required a full day's preparation, along with 3 types of vegetables from the market, and a cake that had clearly come from the best bakery in Cheyenne. They sat around the table in the boarding house dining room, Peter and Ruby and Mrs. Crandall and Garrison, who had been invited and was clearly charmed by Mrs. Crandall, which Peter noted with interest, and they ate and talked, and the mood was one of genuine, earned celebration, the kind that happens when something has been fought for and won by its merits. Garrison and Mrs. Crandall were deep in conversation about the recovery of the remaining estate funds by the time the cake was served, and Peter looked at Ruby across the table in the candlelight, and she was looking back at him with the full warmth of her attention, relaxed in a way he had not seen her fully relaxed before, as if the weight that had been across her shoulders for 2 years had been put down at last. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like myself," she said. "I had forgotten what that felt like." He reached across the table and took her hand. Mrs. Crandall, who was discussing legal mechanisms with Garrison and definitely not watching them, appeared to be smiling at her plate. They left Cheyenne 2 weeks later, once the legal documentation had been processed and the transfer of the Morgan estate had been officially recorded, and Garrison had everything in order. Mrs. Crandall came to the livery stable to see them off, embracing Ruby with a fierceness that made clear the 2 years of separation had cost her considerably, and shaking Peter's hand with both of hers and looking at him steadily. "You will take care of her," she said. "She takes considerable care of herself," he said. "She does," Mrs. Crandall agreed. "She learned it from her mother and her father and from 2 years in a mountain valley, and it is a fine quality. But there is no shame in being cared for by someone who is worthy of doing so." She held his gaze. "Are you worthy, Mr. Ashford?" He held her gaze back. "I intend to spend a considerable amount of time finding out," he said. She released his hand. "Good answer," she said. "Bring her to see me at Christmas." The ride to Carson Creek took 4 days, and it was entirely different from the 8-day ride from Silverton Valley to Cheyenne, because the purpose was different and the weight was different, and they were entirely different people from who they had been on that first morning in the mountain valley. They rode side by side on the wider trails, and when the trails narrowed they rode tandem and talked over their shoulders, and on the first night they camped by a creek and Ruby cooked. She always cooked. She had, she explained, opinions about camp cooking that she preferred to execute personally, and it was a very good supper, and afterward they sat close enough together that their shoulders touched and watched the fire and talked about the future. "The house at Carson Creek is gone," she said. "The fire took it completely, but the foundation is there, and the barn survived. Holt used the barn, the ranch hands kept it up, and the cattle, what he did not sell, is still on the range." "We can build," he said, and the "we" came so naturally that neither of them commented on it, but he felt Ruby go still for just a moment and then soften slightly, leaning into the word. "We can build," she agreed. "I know some about carpentry," he said, "and considerably more about procurement. I can get materials, supplies, the right people." "I know a great deal about carpentry," she said, with the dry gravity that was one of his very favorite things about her. I rebuilt a barn roof alone in November. We will be much faster together, he said. She turned to look at him, and in the firelight she looked like the morning in the mountain valley and the evenings on the trail and all the accumulated hours of her that he had gathered into himself without quite meaning to, and he thought that he would spend a very long time and not run out of her. "Peter," she said. "Yes." "Will you marry me?" He blinked. "I was going to ask you that." "I know," she said, "but I am asking you." She looked at him with her clear, direct eyes and the small smile at the corner of her mouth. "I am not a woman who waits for things to come to her. I go and get them." "I am aware of that," he said. "You built a house in a mountain valley and waited 2 years to take back your inheritance. I would call that going and getting." "It took a while," she said. "The offer stands." He took her hand and held it and looked at her and felt the particular fullness of a moment that has arrived after a long time of not quite being able to imagine it. "Yes," he said. "Ruby Morgan, I will marry you." She let out a small breath, as if she had been holding it, which surprised him and delighted him. The idea that she had been nervous, that under all the directness and competence there was a woman who had not been entirely certain what he would say. "Good," she said. "That is settled then." He kissed her again, this time in the light of the fire, with the Wyoming night around them and the creek going over its stones and the horses moving peacefully nearby. And it was, he thought, one of the finest moments of his 31 years. They arrived at Carson Creek 4 days after leaving Cheyenne, and Ruby pulled Patience to a stop on the hill above the valley and looked down at what remained. The creek was the same, wide and clear, running over flat gray stones, bordered by cottonwoods that were fully leafed now in the late June warmth. The valley was the same, wide open, with the deep green of the surrounding hills and the particular quality of light that belonged to this specific geography, that Ruby's eyes recognized even after 2 years. The barn was standing, and the corrals and the well and the stone foundation of the house, which sat among the grass like the memory of itself. The cattle were visible on the far slope, not as many as there should have been, but there. Ruby sat her horse and was quiet for a long moment. "I have dreamed about this view," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were tight on the reins. "I did not know if I would ever see it again." "You are seeing it," Peter said from beside her. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright and her chin was steady, and she looked like someone who has come through a long thing and arrived at the far side of it. "Come on," she said. "I will show you where I want to put the house." They went down into the valley. They spent that summer building. Peter had not exaggerated his procurement skills. Within a week of arriving, he had located a timber supplier in the nearest town, a good carpenter who was looking for work, and a stonemason who happened to be between jobs. The foundation was sound, and the carpenter said it would take 8 weeks to frame and enclose a proper house. Ruby had opinions about every aspect of the design. She wanted the kitchen large, a proper kitchen, with a good stove and real counter space, and a window facing east for the morning light. She wanted a porch on the south side. She wanted a study, which the carpenter raised an eyebrow at, and she explained, without any particular defensiveness, that she read a great deal and needed somewhere to do it. Peter watched her instruct the carpenter with the precise, specific authority of someone who had spent 2 years doing everything herself, and had a very clear idea of what good construction looked like. The carpenter, a weathered man named Hobbs who had been building in Wyoming for 20 years, appeared slightly startled at first and then deeply respectful. "Your wife knows her building," Hobbs said to Peter one afternoon. "She does," Peter said. "She built most of a cabin herself in Silverton Valley." Hobbs looked impressed. "That would account for it," he said. Peter and Ruby were not yet married, a practicality that bothered Mrs. Crandall considerably, as expressed in her weekly letters, which arrived by the mail rider who came through Carson Creek every Friday. They had agreed, on the ride down from Cheyenne, to marry once the house was standing, which was partly practical and partly something more, a sense that the house mattered as the foundation of the thing they were building, and that the ceremony should come when the foundation was real. The house was finished at the end of August, 3 days after Ruby's 27th birthday, which they celebrated with a cake that Peter had ridden to town to acquire, and which was, he readily admitted, not as good as what Mrs. Crandall would have produced, but was offered with equal intention. Ruby stood in the kitchen on the morning after the house was finished and looked at the east window and the morning light coming through it, and she turned to where Peter was leaning in the doorway drinking his coffee, and she said, "It is better than I imagined." "Is that possible?" he asked, "given how precisely you imagined it?" "Apparently," she said, with the smile that he lived for, and she crossed the kitchen and kissed him, and the coffee got cold. They were married in September 1878 in the town of Clearwater, which was the nearest town with a proper church and a minister. Mrs. Crandall came from Cheyenne and brought Garrison, whose presence seemed less professional and more personal at this point, which Mrs. Crandall appeared to consider a satisfactory development. Hobbs came with his wife. 2 neighboring ranch families came, people who had known James Morgan and were very pleased indeed to see his daughter back in the valley where she belonged. Ruby wore a dress in deep green that she had made herself, which Peter thought was entirely characteristic of her, and also made her look extraordinary. He wore his best suit, which had been pressed by the hotel in Clearwater and was improved for the effort. The minister asked the questions and they answered them, and the church was small and the congregation was limited and the ceremony was simple, and it was everything. He put a ring on her finger. He had ordered it from a jeweler in Cheyenne. A simple gold band that she had told him, when he had shown her the catalog, was the one she would choose, and he looked at her face, and she was looking back at him with her whole, unguarded self, not performing for the occasion but fully present in it, and he thought that he had never in his life been so clearly in the right place. They went back to Carson Creek the following morning and began their life. The winter of 1878 was hard. The way Wyoming winters are, weeks of cold that settled in the bones, snow that came in earnest by November and stayed until March. They worked the ranch through it, feeding cattle and mending fences and managing the 1,000 small tasks of a working property, and they spent the evenings in the house they had built, with the fireplace going and the lamps lit, and Ruby read or wrote letters while Peter worked on the accounts or the endless planning that a working ranch required. It was not a romantic winter in the way of poems and novels. It was cold and practical and full of hard work. It was also the most content Peter had ever been in his life, a fact he found it useful to examine on the mornings when the thermometer read something alarming and the cattle needed feeding regardless. He told Ruby this one evening, watching her at the table with a book open in front of her and the firelight on her face. She looked up at him. "Even in January," she said, "when the pipes froze and you spent 3 hours in the barn." "Even then," he said. She set down the book. "Me too," she said simply. Spring came, as it always does, with the extravagant relief that Wyoming spring produces: warm wind, returning birds, the grass going from gray to green almost overnight, the creek rising on its banks. Ruby walked every inch of the Morgan land in the first weeks of spring, checking fences, counting cattle, reading the land with the attention of someone who loves it specifically and personally. On a morning in April, she came back from the east pasture with a look of contained, private excitement that he recognized. She always looked like that when she had decided something. "What?" he said. She sat across the kitchen table from him and laced her fingers together and looked at him with bright eyes. "We are going to need that study," she said. He looked at her. The study had been their compromise. She had wanted it for herself, and he had joked about the number of children who would fight over who got to read in it. "Ruby," he said. "March," she said. "I calculate March." He stood up from his chair and went around the table and pulled her up and held her, and she laughed against his shoulder, that bright, genuine laugh. And outside the April sun was full on the valley, and the meadowlarks were going at it with everything they had. Their son was born in March of 1879, which was precisely when Ruby had calculated. because Ruby Morgan was accurate about most things. They named him James for her father, and he arrived at 3 in the morning in a snowstorm, as if the weather wanted to be dramatic, with a local midwife and Peter, who had never been present at a birth before, and discovered that it was simultaneously terrifying and miraculous. James was small and loud and had a tuft of dark hair like his father's and a chin that was already very much like his mother's, and Ruby held him in the gray light of the early morning and looked at him with an expression Peter had never seen on her face before, entirely open, entirely undone, without any armor at all. "Hello," she said to the baby, very quietly. "I have been thinking about you." Peter sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her shoulders and looked at his son, who was looking at the ceiling with the baffled expression of a person to whom everything is completely new. "He looks like he has opinions already," Peter said. "He gets that from me," Ruby said. He kissed her hair. "Yes," he said, "he does." James Morgan Ashford grew up knowing the land of Carson Creek from the back of his first pony, which he received on his 3rd birthday, and rode with the natural confidence of a child who had been watching his mother handle horses since he could focus his eyes. He was a serious child who asked very good questions and had strong feelings about fairness, which Ruby said came from her, and Peter said came from both of them, which was the truth. In the spring of 1882, Ruby came in from the garden with the same look she had worn that April morning in 1879, and Peter, who was washing up at the kitchen basin, looked at her over his shoulder. "March again," he said. She shook her head. "November," she said. Their daughter, Clara Alois Ashford, arrived in November 1882, named for the aunt who had never given up looking for her mother. Clara was born in the same bed as her brother, in the house that her parents had built together, in the valley that had been Ruby's father's and was now fully, legally, properly Ruby's own. She had her mother's auburn hair from the first and her father's gray eyes, and she announced herself to the world with a volume that James, 3 years old and deeply interested in this new development, described as very noisy. Mrs. Crandall, who had married the lawyer Garrison quietly in 1881, in a ceremony that the family considered long overdue, came to Carson Creek for Clara's birth and stayed 3 weeks, during which she reorganized the kitchen and taught James to play cards and told Clara, holding her in the rocking chair on the south porch, things about her grandmother and great-grandmother that would eventually be written down by Clara herself many years later. The Holt matter was fully concluded by 1881. Holt remained in prison. The estate had been fully restored, and the last of the legal proceedings had been wrapped up by Garrison with the thoroughness of a man who took professional pride in closed cases. The Carson Creek property was unencumbered, clear in title, and growing steadily under Ruby and Peter's joint management. Ruby had not forgotten San Francisco. In the summer of 1884, with James 5 and Clara nearly 2, they made the journey, a decision that required considerable planning and the assistance of the Greer family from Silverton Valley, who were contacted by letter, and came to Carson Creek for a month to watch the ranch and the children while their parents were away. Peter had told Ruby about San Francisco years ago, sitting around a campfire on the Wyoming plains, and she had carried the description with her like a promise. She stood on a hill in the city on a July morning and looked out at the bay, at the water that went all the way to the horizon and kept going, at the fog that was beginning to pull back from the hills, at the boats on the water and the improbable teeming life of a city that had built itself on a peninsula at the edge of the continent, and she was very quiet for a long time. He stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and let her look. "It is exactly as you described it," she said finally. "I described it badly," he said. "It requires seeing." "Yes," she said, "most things do." She turned to look at him. Her hair was blowing loose in the bay wind and her eyes were full of light. "Thank you for bringing me here. You would have gotten here yourself eventually," he said. "I would," she agreed. "But it is better with you." She took his arm and they walked down into the city, into the fog-washed morning light and the noise and the salt smell and the improbable, magnificent fact of it. They went home to Carson Creek. They went home to James, who had spent the month in command of the Greer children and had several things to tell them, and to Clara, who was talking in full sentences now and had an opinion about everything she encountered, and to the south porch and the kitchen window and the study where Ruby still read in the evenings. In September of that year, Peter rode to the ridge above Silverton Valley. He went alone on a clear fall morning because he had been wanting to go back since they had left 6 years ago, and because something in him wanted to see it again now that everything had been resolved. He left before dawn and arrived at the ridge just as the sun was full up. The valley was unchanged. More than unchanged, it looked, if anything, more settled into itself, more quietly permanent. The Greer family had, as Ruby had asked, kept the cabin up. It was still standing. The garden plot was visible below. The barn was intact. He sat on his horse on the ridge and looked down at it for a long time, thinking about the morning he had first appeared on this ridge, cold, uncertain, with a dead woman's name in his pocket, and heard humming rising through the morning air, and smelled wood smoke and bacon, and discovered that the ghost was alive and cooking breakfast. He had ridden into that valley hunting something he thought was finished. He had ridden out of it carrying the beginning of everything that came after. He turned his horse and started back toward Carson Creek. The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew slowly, with the careful attention of two people who understood that everything worth having is built over time. They added cattle and later sheep, diversifying because Ruby had read everything she could find about ranch management and had, characteristically, done her own research and reached her own conclusions. They hired on 2 ranch hands by 1885 and a third by 1887, men who stayed because the work was fair and the pay was honest, and the management was, as one of them put it to the other, the sanest outfit in 3 counties. James grew up straight and capable and good-humored, with a gift for the land that made his grandfather's memory feel present in him, as if James Morgan had found a way to come forward through time. Clara grew up fierce and curious, with a habit of climbing things she was told not to climb and reading things she was told she was too young for, and arguing positions she had considered carefully enough that the arguments were generally worth hearing. Peter taught them both to ride and to shoot and to read a map. Ruby taught them to cook and to build and to read people. By 1888, Peter was 39 and Ruby was 36, and the Carson Creek Ranch was the best it had been since James Morgan had built it, possibly better. The house they had constructed in the summer of 1878 had been expanded twice, once to add a real dining room and once to add a bedroom for Clara, who had expressed, at 4 years old, a strong preference not to share her space, and it sat in the valley with the confidence of a thing that has been put down properly and intends to stay. They sat on the south porch in the September evenings when the light was golden and long, and Ruby would sometimes read aloud. She had a gift for it, a rhythm and a clarity that made even difficult prose plain, and Peter would sit with his coffee and listen and watch the light move across the valley that had been reclaimed and rebuilt and loved back into itself. He thought sometimes about the 12 years since he had crested that ridge. He thought about the lawyer in Laramie who had sent him after a dead woman. He thought about the photograph on the mantel inside the house, the one taken in Caldwell's studio in Cheyenne, the one that showed 2 people sitting side by side with a warmth that spoke of something not yet named but already certain. He thought about biscuits. "You are thinking about something," Ruby said one September evening, not looking up from her book. "How can you tell?" "You have a particular quality of silence when you are thinking," she said, "different from just being quiet." He looked at her. She was 40 years old now. She was 36 in 1888, and in the years since she had grown more fully herself, if that was possible. The auburn hair had a few strands of silver at the temples. The capable hands were more so. The eyes were exactly as direct and clear as they had been on that morning in the doorway of a mountain cabin. "I was thinking about the morning I rode into Silverton Valley," he said. She looked up at him then. "What about it?" "I was looking for a ghost," he said. "And I found a woman cooking breakfast," she said with a smile. "The beginning of everything," he said. She set down her book and looked at him, as she had looked at him across fires and tables and the distance of a mountain valley, with her whole attention and without armor. "I am glad you came," she said. "I am glad you had biscuits," he said. She threw her book at him. He caught it. She laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that he had been collecting for 10 years and never tired of, and he set the book down and reached for her hand. And they sat on the south porch of the house they had built, in the valley that was hers by right and by love and by the hard-won fact of having fought for it, in the Wyoming evening that was going gold and then amber, and then the deep, soft purple of a September dusk, and the meadowlarks were finishing their day's work in the grass below. And James could be heard somewhere in the barn doing something productive, and Clara was visible at the kitchen window, doing something she had clearly decided not to announce, and the creek ran over its stones the way it had always run, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and everything was, at last, exactly as it should be.